Okay, now let us look at the other two concepts, that is the change in supply and the change in quantity supplied. Okay, we have change, well this is not, okay, change in supply and change in quantity supplied, change in quantity supplied. Okay, these are the two concepts that are related to supply. The other name for change in supply is the shift. Change in supply, the other name is the shift in the supply curve. So we can also use shift in the supply curve. Shift in supply, shift in the supply curve, in the supply curve. This will represent the other name for change in supply. And the other name for change in quantity supplied, it would also mean the movement, yes, the movement along the same supply curve. Movement along the same supply curve. Okay, so the idea behind here is not to understand the different names, but to understand what leads to change in supply and what leads to change in quantity supplied, and what is the distinction between the two concepts. So I tried to use the other names to explain to you that change in supply, normally the graph for supply curve will shift. Either it will shift to the left or to the right, but it has to shift because of an increase or decrease, in supply. And the change in quantity supplied in this case, because what is leading to change in quantity supplied is not other factors but the price of the commodity. In this case, the supply curve will not shift, but rather there will be a movement along the same supply curve, because consumers will be buying different quantities of the good or services given specified prices in the marketplace. So let us start by the first concept, change in supply. Change in supply. By definition, and I'm going to define it briefly. I'm going to briefly define this concept, that change in supply is an increase or decrease. I hope you can follow those arrows. Is an increase or decrease in supply due to change in the factors affecting supply, change in the factors affecting supply, other than price. So in this case, what is leading to a change in supply is not the price of the commodity, but rather the other factors that affect the supply for the commodity, being it weather, being it taste and preference, being it the state of technology, etc., etc. Those factors that we mentioned, except price, are the ones that lead to change in supply. So it is an increase or decrease in supply due to change in the factors affecting supply other than the price of the commodity. Okay, and the diagram is very simple. The graph is very simple. You simply draw, and in this case, I'm not going to. This is not. Okay, let us try to. Let me use a different color maybe to make it clear to you. Okay, this can do. Let us try blue. Okay. Okay, Okay, so in this case I am not going to use the supply schedule. I am only going to draw the graphs. I am only going to draw the supply curve to show the shift, to show the shift in the supply curve. So we say that the supply curve is sloping upward from left to right, and it is observing the law of supply, which states that the higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied. So we can have the supply curve here. We can have this first supply curve. Call this supply curve 1. Okay. Call it supply curve 1, and we can have another supply curve. You can call it S1. Call it S1. You can as well have another supply curve maybe on the other side. Call it S2. You can call it S2. Okay, S2. So when we talk of the shift in the supply curve or a change in supply, we mean that as the factors affecting supply applies, supply will tend to increase or decrease. So for example, if the weather is favorable, for example, okay, if the weather is favorable, we expect that maize producers will produce more. They will produce more. And by producing more, it means that the supply for maize will increase. So the graph for maize will shift outward. So here it is shifting outward. It is now shifting to S1. You see, because of a favorable weather conditions, or maybe because of the technology, for example. Maybe if people are using, let's say, tractors, they are using irrigation, modern irrigation schemes to produce maize. We expect that the supply for maize will increase, and therefore the graph for maize will shift. The supply curve will shift outward. It will shift to the left. Now the vice versa is true, that when the weather is not favorable, like maybe farmers, they expect that the rainfall will be this season, maybe there will be high rain, there will be favorable rainfall to support the production of maize, and it happens that the season did not go as planned or as expected, or maybe the taste and the preference has changed, or maybe some other factors have applied to the extent that the demand for maize and the production for maize has decreased. In that case, we expect the supply for maize to reduce. So there will be a decrease in supply. We said that it is an increase or decrease. In this case, there was an increase. In the other case, it is now a decrease in supply. So it has now constructed. It has now the supply curve is, there is a contraction, not an expansionary. There is a contraction in the supply curve, while here there was an expansionary in the supply curve. So this is the change in supply. Okay, so now let us look at the other concept, which is the change in quantity supplied. And of course, change in quantity supplied will now be different from the change in supply. Change in supply. So change in quantity supplied, the other name for change in quantity supplied is the movement along the same supply curve. So do not be confused when you are asked to talk about shift in the supply curve or movement along the same supply curve. They are the same thing. Change in supply will also mean shift in the supply curve, and change in quantity supplied will also mean movement along the same supply curve. What you need to understand is what leads to the change in supply and what leads to the change in quantity supplied, and maybe the illustration of the two concepts. Okay, so now let us define change in quantity supplied. Change in quantity supplied. Okay, change in quantity supplied, I'm not sure if this is clear. Okay, change in quantity supplied. Well, we say that this is an increase by definition. Change in quantity supplied is an increase or decrease in quantity supplied. An increase or decrease in quantity supplied due to the change in price, due to the change in the price of the commodity, due to the change in the price of the commodity. Ceteris paribus, do not forget this. Ceteris paribus, do not forget this. This is a very important assumption in economics. In economics, ceteris paribus is a very, very important assumptions, and it means that other factors remain constant. An increase in the price will lead to an increase in quantity supplied, and a decrease in price will lead to a decrease in quantity supplied. Therefore, in this case, when we are defining change in quantity supplied, we are assuming that other factors remain constant. Only the price of the commodity leads to change in quantity supplied. So, quantity supplied in this case are only influenced by the price of the commodity. Other factors remain constant. Okay. We can also illustrate. We can also have an illustration of this explanation. We can draw a graph representing change in quantity supplied, where we'll be having a movement. We'll see the movement along the same supply curve. The quantities will be ranging, they will be changing depending on the price, okay? Depending on the price. But as we are drawing this graph, we are going to observe, as I said earlier, we are going to observe the law of supply. The law of supply, I repeat, it states that the higher the price, the lower the quantity supplied. The higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied. Don't forget this. The higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied. Suppliers will always supply more when the price is high, and they will supply less when the price is low. So the vice versa is true, but don't forget to apply the ceteris paribus condition, okay? So here the graph, we are going to use the normal supply curve, and of course, if I may recall the examples we used previously, I remember we have the price ranging from 0 to 4, from 1 to 4. So we have 1, we have 2, we have 3, we have 4. And I remember the quantities were ranging from 10 to 40, if I'm not mistaken. So we had 0, 10, we had 20 here, then 30, and lastly we had 40. Okay, so we are going to draw the supply curve by observing the law of supply, that the higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied. So when the price was 1, when the price was 1, quantity supplied 10. Okay, yes, quantity supplied 10. So here, okay, when the price increased to 2, quantity supplied went also to 20. When the price, of course, we normally match these two. We have to match them. Okay, when the price increased to 3, quantity supplied also increased to 30. And when the price increased to 4, quantity supplied also increased to 40. So you can see from this simple example that an increase in price leads to an increase in quantity. But the idea behind here is to show you the change in quantity supplied, the movement along the same. Okay, now maybe let's call this point A, we can call this point B, we can call this point C, and lastly we can call that one point D. So there is a movement along these points, from point A to point B, from point B to point C, from point C to point D, or from D to C, C to B, C to B to A, etc., etc. But the idea behind here is to show you how there is a movement along the same supply curve. Quantities are moving along the same supply curve, indicating a change in quantity supplied, and also by indicating a change in quantity supplied, it also portrays the law of supply. So that is the distinction between change in quantity supplied and change in supply. Now, to finalize this topic, of course, there are many other things to talk about when you are discussing the law of supply. I mean, when you are discussing the theory of supply. Of course, there are elasticities. I have not talked about them, and many other concepts. But let me finalize this section by talking about the producer and the consumer surplus.